Every adult in your life has said it. Your parents, your older coworkers, that one relative who brings it up at every family gathering like it's the most original thought anyone has ever had. Renting is throwing money away. You've heard it so many times it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like weather, just something that exists, that's always there, that nobody questions. I'm going to question it today. Not because renting is always the right answer, but because the math behind that phrase, the actual arithmetic, has changed so dramatically in the last 3 years that anyone still repeating it as universal truth is giving you advice built for a world that no longer exists. My name is Astrid, and today we're going to do something that feels almost rebellious in 2026. We're going to run the rent versus by calculation honestly, with current numbers, without assuming the answer in advance. And what we find is going to surprise most people who've been told their whole lives that buying is always smarter. Subscribe if you want financial clarity that doesn't start with the conclusion already decided. Let's start with where the renting is throwing money away idea comes from, because it wasn't always wrong. For most of the 20th century and into the early 2000s, the math genuinely favored buying in most American markets. Home prices appreciated steadily, mortgage rates were manageable relative to incomes, and the gap between monthly rent and monthly mortgage payments on comparable properties was small enough that the equity you built while owning made ownership clearly superior over time. That world ended somewhere around 2020 and has not returned. Here's what changed. Between 2020 and 2026, home prices increased by approximately 45% nationally. Mortgage rates went from historic lows near 3% to where they sit now, between 6.2% and 6.8%. The combination of those two things, dramatically higher prices financed at dramatically higher rates, produced monthly mortgage payments that, in many markets, are 60% to 100% higher than comparable monthly rents. That gap is the entire math of the rent versus buy debate. And right now, in 2026, it has never been wider. Let me show you what this looks like in a specific, real scenario. A 3-bedroom house in a mid-sized American metro area, listed at $420,000. The rent on a comparable 3-bedroom in the same neighborhood, $2,100 per month. If you buy that house with 10% down, $42,000, your mortgage at 6.4% is $2,390 per month in principal and interest alone. Add property taxes at $380 per month, insurance at $220, PMI at $185, and maintenance reserve at $350. Total monthly cost of ownership, $3,525. Monthly cost of renting the comparable property, $2,100. The monthly gap between renting and buying the same type of property, $1,425 per month. $1,425 per month is not a rounding error. It is $17,100 per year. It is real money that exists or doesn't exist depending on which side of this decision you're on. Now here's what the renting is throwing money away crowd never tells you about that $1,425. If you rent and invest the difference, the $1,425 every month that you're not spending on the ownership premium, in a basic index fund earning 8% annually, here's what happens over 10 years. You accumulate $261,000. $261,000. In an account that is liquid, that doesn't require a roof replacement, that isn't subject to a special assessment from an HOA, that you can access without selling anything or taking out a loan against your own equity. Meanwhile, the person who bought that $420,000 house, in a market where prices are expected to appreciate modestly at 2% to 3% annually, owns a home worth approximately $510,000 after 10 years. Sounds great. Except they still owe roughly $340,000 on their mortgage. Their actual equity is $170,000. And they've paid $423,000 in total housing costs over that decade, mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, PMI, and maintenance. The renter with $261,000 invested is not obviously behind. In many scenarios, When you account
Chart
for
A
the
shows a
full
steady
cost of ownership
increase.
honestly,
In
they're
comparison,
ahead.
chart B
This is the
fluctuates.
math that the renting is throwing money away phrase was never designed to survive. It was built for a world where the gap between rent and mortgage was small, where home price appreciation was strong, and where mortgage rates were low enough that buying wasn't dramatically more expensive than renting. That world is gone. The phrase stayed. Now, I want to be fair to the other side. Because buying is not irrational, and I'm not here to tell you never to buy a home. There are real advantages to ownership that don't show up in a pure monthly cost comparison. Stability, the ability to stay somewhere indefinitely without a landlord's decision affecting your life. Customization, being able to paint walls, renovate kitchens, build the space into something that actually fits your life. The psychological value of permanence and rootedness, which for many people is worth a genuine financial premium. And in some markets, the rent versus buy math does still favor buying. Markets where rent has risen faster than home prices. Markets where property tax rates are low. Markets with strong price appreciation history and limited supply. The math is not universal. It is specific to your market, your income, your timeline, and your alternatives. What I'm pushing back against is not the act of buying. I'm pushing back against the assumption that buying is always the right answer, regardless of market conditions, regardless of your financial situation, regardless of what the current numbers actually say. Because renting is throwing money away, as an unconditional statement, is only true if you're throwing the difference away. If you're investing it, actually, consistently, automatically, the statement collapses. You are not throwing money away. You are building wealth through a different vehicle. A more liquid vehicle. A vehicle that doesn't require a down payment, a mortgage, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, or the emotional weight of being one broken HVAC away from a $6,000 bill. Here's the honest framework for making this decision in 2026. First, run the actual numbers for your specific market. Look at the total monthly cost of ownership, not just the mortgage payment, on a home comparable to what you'd rent. Compare it to what you'd actually pay in rent. Calculate the gap. Then ask yourself honestly, am I going to invest that gap every month, or is it going to disappear into lifestyle spending? If you're going to invest it, the rent and invest path deserves serious consideration. If it's going to disappear, ownership may be the forced savings mechanism that works better for your actual behavior. Second, think honestly about your timeline. The rent versus buy math shifts significantly depending on how long you stay. The transaction costs of buying, closing costs, agent commissions, loan origination fees, typically run 5% to 8% of the purchase price. On a $420,000 home, that's $21,000 to $34,000 that you spend on day one and recover only if you stay long enough for appreciation to absorb it. The commonly cited break-even point in current market conditions is 5 to 7 years. If there's any meaningful chance you're moving before then, for career, for family, for relationship, for the simple reality that life changes, buying at these prices and rates is likely to cost you money rather than make you money. Third, separate the financial decision from the emotional one. Buying a home carries enormous emotional weight in American culture. It signals stability, success, maturity. It satisfies something deep in most people about permanence and belonging. Those feelings are real and they have value. But they are not financial arguments. And making a decision that costs you $17,000 more per year because of how it will look to other people or how it will make you feel about yourself is an expensive way to manage your emotional life. The question is not, am I the kind of person who owns a home? The question is, does buying a home in my specific market at this specific moment in my life make financial sense? Those are different questions. They deserve different answers. The lie that renting is always throwing money away has cost people real money. It has pushed people into purchases they couldn't sustain, in markets that didn't reward it, at prices that the math never supported, because the cultural pressure to own was louder than the financial reality screaming in the opposite direction. You are allowed to rent. You are allowed to invest the difference. You are allowed to look at a market where buying costs $1,400 more per month than renting and decide that the ownership premium is not worth what it costs right now, in this specific moment, at these specific prices and rates. That is not giving up on homeownership. That is not lacking ambition. That is understanding that the math of a decision matters more than the cultural story built around it. When the math changes, when rates come down, when prices correct, when the gap between renting and owning narrows to a point where ownership produces better outcomes, you will be in a far better financial position to act on it if you've spent the intervening years investing rather than being house poor. The math is different now. You're allowed to make a different decision. I'll see you in the next one.